They saw it first as an error on the board. The council command gallery floated in disciplined silence as sensor officers refined the return, stripping interference, boosting gain, isolating mass and silhouette until the lone human vessel resolved against the starfield, and the senior admirals allowed themselves small, private expressions of satisfaction as the data scrolled in clean and complete at 0.03 light seconds, hull profile blunt and asymmetrical, armor layers exposed like geological strata, no energy veins, no shield harmonics, no aesthetic language they recognized as modern, and the consensus formed quickly that this was not a warship meant for a contemporary battle space, but a relic drifting forward under stubborn momentum rather than understanding. Displacement figures stabilized. Power output read steady, unspectacular. Weapon ports registered as linear cavities, inert until proven otherwise. One admiral clicked her mandibles in polite disbelief and remarked that the species had arrived centuries late to the wrong conversation, while another noted that the hull plating alone weighed more than some council escorts, as if mass could compensate for ignorance, as if piling metal on metal was anything but a confession of backward doctrine. Primitive, someone said softly, and the word carried. They overlaid comparative schematics. 10,000 council vessels in layered formation, elegant arcs of energy potential and distributed command intelligence, versus a single human battleship advancing without escort, broadcasting no heraldry beyond a simple transponder code and a gravity signature that spoke of brute engines rather than refined field manipulation. The processing algorithms updated probability trees in real time, projecting compliance within minutes, resistance measured in seconds, casualties negligible on the council side, and the admirals allowed the numbers to reassure them, because numbers had never lied to them before. One officer highlighted the absence of visible shielding and smiled thinly, noting that even at maximum tolerance, the human hull would not survive a standard opening volley, not against weapons designed to melt. Continents and cauterize atmospheres, a relic hull, a relic mind. The cultural liaison leaned forward, already composing the language of annexation, the phrasing of uplift and correction, the clauses that would convert a species into labor and resource with legal elegance, and the chair of the council fleet nodded once, satisfied that the encounter would be instructional rather than costly. Humanity, it was agreed, had clung to kinetic superstition and paid for it with relevance. The ship's lines were honest in their crudeness, straight where council craft curved, thick where theirs were efficient, and the admirals mistook honesty for naivety because that mistake had served them well across 300 compliant worlds. Fit for processing, the chair concluded. A soft chime marked the completion of the scan, all parameters locked, no hidden emitters, no exotic mass, distortions, no surprises. They laughed, not loudly, but with the quiet amusement of experts confronted with a museum piece that had wandered onto the floor by mistake. No shields detected, no energy doctrine detected. The battleship continued its approach at a constant vector, unhurried, as if unaware of the attention. And the council formation did not adjust because there was no reason to waste fuel or thought on something already categorized, already solved, already assigned a place in the logistical. After-action reports as a footnote to efficiency. The chair authorized the opening communique and, with it, the preliminary targeting solution, confident that the next chapter of the encounter would proceed exactly as the last 1,000 had. They did not notice the way the human ship held its course, steady and deliberate, as if listening rather than drifting. They addressed the humans as a procedural certainty. The Council's first contact lattice unfolded across the void, layered with translation matrices and diplomatic precedents, and the voice that emerged was calm, cultured, and unhurried, reciting jurisdictional claims and historical outcomes, as if reading a weather report, explaining that the human vessel had crossed into regulated space, that its species was unregistered, non-compliant, and therefore eligible for corrective integration under Council mandate, and that surrender protocols would be accepted immediately to preserve life and infrastructure. The admirals watched their displays as the message propagated at light speed, watched probability curves tighten toward inevitability, 10,000 ships holding position while targeting solutions warmed in the background, and they expected hesitation. Confusion, perhaps a clumsy assertion of sovereignty from a culture that had not yet learned how small it was. Instead, the human reply arrived cleanly within 3 seconds, routed through no intermediary. Voice steady, diction precise, no elevation in pulse or power draw detectable across the battleship's hull, and the chair noted with faint irritation that the humans had not asked clarifying questions, had not requested delays, had not sought negotiation beyond acknowledgement of receipt. "We recognize your fleet," the human said, and paused long enough for the translators to finish their work. "And we decline your authority." The word decline echoed longer than the admirals liked. The human voice continued, outlining their position without flourish. The vessel was operating under human law. Human space began where human presence was established, and no surrender would be offered. There was no insult embedded in the phrasing, no bravado, only a statement delivered as if refusal were an administrative outcome rather than a provocation, and several council officers leaned closer to their consoles, rechecking aggression flags because the tone did not match the content. The cultural liaison attempted to interject, reframing the mandate as an opportunity, citing precedents where resistance had ended poorly, but the human cut the channel with polite efficiency and reopened it on a narrower bandwidth, reducing the exchange to essentials. "We will not kneel," the human said calmly. For a fraction of a second, the gallery was silent. Compliance projections destabilized, branching wildly as the algorithms struggled to reconcile the refusal with the material imbalance on display. 67 human ships now resolving behind the lead battleship as passive sensors widened their scope. Still no shields, still no energy signatures, still nothing that fit the Council's understanding of sensible defiance. One admiral muttered that this was posturing, another that it was ignorance, and the chair felt the faint sting of having their certainty delayed, not threatened, just delayed, which was somehow worse. Targeting grids brightened from amber to red across 10,000 hulls, energy capacitors cycling up in synchronized waves, and evacuation advisories were issued to nearby civilian lanes out of habit rather than concern. Refusal logged, authority challenged. The chair authorized enforcement, measures with a single gesture, satisfied that the lesson would be brief. And as the fleet aligned for the opening volley, the human battleship maintained its vector, engines burning with the same unremarkable steadiness, as if the word kneel had never belonged in its vocabulary. In all, the Council fired to end the conversation. Energy lanced outward in disciplined geometry. 10,000 ships releasing coherent beams and particle floods, calibrated to overwhelm planetary shields. The opening volley lasting exactly 12 seconds as doctrine required, enough power to erase resistance without wasting charge, and the admirals watched with practiced detachment as the luminous storm crossed the gap and struck the human battleship head-on, saturating its hull in cascading color that should have vaporized armor and boiled internal compartments to vacuum. Sensors flared, spectral returns spiked. The gallery waited for the collapse marker, the brief spike that always preceded fragmentation, and when it did not come, several officers assumed a delay in telemetry rather than a failure in effect. The Saibam, human ship, remained. Energy readings rolled back from the impact zone in orderly decay curves, not the chaotic scatter of a dying hull, and the first analyst to speak did so hesitantly, reporting that absorption metrics were exceeding modeled thresholds, recalculating in real time as more data flooded in. The second volley followed immediately, heavier, layered, frequencies modulated to bypass adaptive plating, and still the battleship held its line, armor layers glowing dull red and then cooling, heat shunted inward and bled away through channels the Council had dismissed as structural redundancy. Numbers stabilized on the board, unwelcome in their clarity. 97% of incoming energy absorbed, dissipated, or redirected, with the remaining 3% failing to penetrate beyond the outermost strata. 97%. A third volley struck, this one joined by precision lances from the inner rings, and the human vessel's mass signature did not fluctuate. Its power output did not spike. Its trajectory did not waver by a measurable fraction of a degree. The admirals leaned forward, now, disbelief edging into their posture as targeting solutions refreshed and refreshed again, each insisting that the next configuration would work, because it always had. One officer suggested a localized shield bleed-through, another a sensor ghost. But the data refused to cooperate, showing instead a hull designed to accept punishment as an input rather than a threat, thick armor spaced to trap and exhaust energy, layers sacrificial by intent rather than accident. "Damage assessment?" the chair demanded. "Minimal," came the answer, after a pause too long to disguise. "No breach detected, no systems loss detected." The human ship responded not with fire, but with silence, allowing the council to expend itself, to commit to the act, to cross the line fully, and the restraint unsettled the gallery more than retaliation would have. Evacuation counters ticked. Upward as civilian lanes diverted automatically, 20 million lives moved aside from a battle space that was no longer theoretical, and the council fleet's capacitors cycled again, dumping heat, drawing power, preparing to escalate, because escalation was the only remaining language that fit the situation. It isn't working. That realization spread without being spoken, visible in the way officers checked each other's displays, in the way probability curves loosened and then fractured, branching into outcomes the models had never favored. The human battleship's outer armor finally shed its glow entirely, returning to matte darkness, scarred but intact. And for the first time since contact, the Council's sensors registered a deliberate change. Internal mass shifting, systems aligning, engines adjusting vector by a fraction that was too small to be evasive and too precise to be accidental. 74 seconds of sustained fire, 97% absorbed. The chair ordered a temporary ceasefire, not announced, just executed as beams cut off mid-cycle. And in the sudden quiet, the human ship continued forward, untouched enough to make the absence of destruction feel like an accusation. And the council understood, dimly and too late, that the first blow had been meant to end doubt, and instead had created it. They realized the humans were done waiting. The first change was subtle, a fractional shift in vector that rippled across the human formation as if the ships shared a single intent. Engines spooling not upward in flare, but inward in compression, mass signatures tightening as thrust fields aligned. And then the acceleration hit. Not as a burst, but as a sustained, controlled burn that pushed the battleship and its 66 companions forward at Mach-equivalent rates the Council had only ever associated with short-lived interceptors. Velocity counters climbed and did not stop. Inertial dampening estimates failed outright. Predicted crew survivability curves flatlined and were dismissed because they made no sense if applied to living beings. The humans closed the distance. Council formations began to deform under the pressure of approach, not from impact but from geometry, from the realization that the spacing which had once ensured overlapping fire now created lanes. The humans were deliberately threading, vectors chosen to force constant recalculation, to pull escorts out of alignment and command ships into exposed arcs. Orders cascaded down the fleet to tighten ranks, then to spread, then to rotate, each correction arriving milliseconds too late, as human ships adjusted again, always forward, always faster, the gap collapsing from light seconds to thousands of kilometers in moments that felt indecently brief. They're accelerating through it. One human cruiser punched through a projected kill zone at a relative velocity that overloaded Council tracking, its path a straight line that ignored the elegant curves of defensive doctrine, and two adjacent Council vessels sheared apart. As their own collision avoidance systems fought each other, no human weapons fired. The damage was incidental, the byproduct of presence and speed, and the admirals felt something new enter the room, something colder than fear. Wolves closed the distance. The battleship led the advance, its mass now a weapon simply by refusing to slow, driving the formation inward like a wedge, forcing the Council fleet to compress or scatter, and either choice fed the same outcome as command coherence degraded and local captains began making independent decisions that broke the lattice. Mach counters updated again, higher, sustained, engines burning in a regime the Council had never modeled, because no sane species fought there for more than seconds. The humans did not blink. Their acceleration held 1,000 kilometers, 500, 200. Targeting solutions lagged as angular velocities spiked, beams missing not because of evasion, but because the humans were where the council did not. Expect anything to survive, and the galleries filled with clipped reports of near misses and formation drift. A senior admiral ordered a partial withdrawal to re-establish distance, and the order died halfway down the chain as human ships occupied the very space the council needed to retreat through, vectors chosen with predatory patience. Too close. Too fast. The first human vessel passed within visual range of a council cruiser, its hull scarred and dark, armor plates still bearing the dull marks of absorbed fire, and it did not turn, did not acknowledge the proximity, simply continued on its line as if the council ship were terrain rather than opposition. Shock waves rippled through the fleet as more followed. 67 points of mass rewriting the battle space by motion alone, and the council's numerical advantage became irrelevant because it could no longer be brought to bear in the same direction at the same time. The humans had not rushed, they had advanced. As the formations collapsed inward under relentless pressure, the council finally understood that this phase was not an attack, but a setup, the closing of jaws rather than the bite, and as range dropped into the envelope where new solutions would soon become possible. The human ships maintained their burn, calm and precise, carrying the battle forward on momentum the council could no longer escape. They fired when the numbers settled. The transition was clean, almost gentle, as human ships bled acceleration into firing solutions, vectors locking with mechanical certainty, and the first railguns spoke not in flashes but in absences. Space briefly hollowed where mass had been, and then refilled with consequences, as tungsten slugs crossed the remaining distance in fractions of a second. Council sensors screamed too late, registering impacts before launches, command vessels punched through as if drilled, internal compartments collapsing along the path of each strike, and the admirals watched their center begin to die with no warning beyond the data itself. 14 minutes. That was the window the humans chose, not a flurry, but a measured span of time in which to finish the math. Railguns cycling at rates the council had dismissed as inefficient, missiles threading, the gaps railfire created, guidance systems correcting in microbursts to follow targets already doomed by inertia and geometry. The first command ship vanished under a converged strike that cut power, split structure, and vented atmosphere in a single seamless sequence, and before the debris finished dispersing, the second followed, then the third, decapitation executed, with the calm repetition of a solved equation. Count it. Council formations attempted to respond, energy weapons firing at last with desperation rather than doctrine. But the humans had closed too far and spread too wide, firing lanes overlapping, in ways that made defense irrelevant, and each missed shot became another collision hazard as ships tried to evade at ranges never meant for elegance. Rail slugs tore through hulls and out the far side, continuing on to strike ships beyond, mass conserved, velocity obscene, and the kill counters began to tick upward with horrifying speed. 100 ships neutralized in the first minute. 300 by the third. Missiles bloomed among the railfire, not in saturation but in selection, each one assigned a role. Disable propulsion, sever command spines, collapse sensor arrays, leaving ships alive enough to drift, but dead to the fight, and the council's advantage in numbers became a liability, as more and more hulls cluttered the battle space, blocking arcs, confusing sensors, turning retreat into chaos. The human battleship fired continuously, its rails glowing briefly with waste heat, before cycling again, recoil absorbed and fed back into structure, the ship unmoved by its own violence. This is arithmetic. The admirals shouted orders that never arrived. Command relays dying faster than backups could assume control, and the lattice fractured into isolated pockets of resistance that the humans ignored until they were convenient to erase. 14 minutes stretched, every second accounted for. And by the halfway mark, the Council's central command was gone, its authority reduced to static and wreckage, leaving captains to choose between futile defiance and survival without guidance. 700 ships, 900 1,000. The human fire did not accelerate as panic spread. It did not slow. It remained constant, deliberate, as if paced to a clock only they could see. And the restraint was its own kind of terror because it suggested capacity held in reserve. Missiles detonated within hulls already weakened by rail. Strikes. Internal explosions blooming silently, and evacuation pods scattered uselessly into a battle space with no one left to coordinate recovery. 14 minutes ended exactly when the counter said it would. At 1,800 neutralized vessels, the railguns fell silent, not from depletion, but from decision, and the sudden absence of fire made the surviving Council ships acutely aware of their own breathing, of systems still online, of the fact that they were alive, because the humans had chosen a stopping point. Debris fields drifted where command had been, power signatures fading, and the battle space reconfigured itself around the reality that the Council no longer had a head. Silence after calculation. The human ships held position amid the wreckage, weapons cooling, vectors steady, and as surviving Council captains tried to understand what phase came next, one truth settled across every display with brutal clarity. The kill shot had not been a test of strength, but of bookkeeping, and the humans had balanced the ledger precisely as intended. The humans stopped firing to speak. Across the wreckage of the Council's shattered center, amid drifting hulls and cooling debris, a wideband transmission overrode. Local channels and propagated outward, not just to the surviving fleet, but beyond it. Relayed automatically by stunned comboys and civilian repeaters, carrying a single human voice that was neither raised nor amplified beyond clarity. The pause itself unsettled the battle space more than continued destruction would have. Weapons falling silent while targeting solutions remained locked, human ships holding perfect station among the dead as if time had been asked to wait. "This is a legal notice," the human said. The phrase translated cleanly across species and dialects, stripped of idiom, and the Council captains who still had bridges felt the strange humiliation of being addressed not as enemies, but as subjects of a procedure. The broadcast continued, outlining terms without flourish. Humanity did not recognize the Council's claim to ownership of sentient beings, did not permit slavery, processing, or coerced integration under any name, and considered such practices crimes subject to prosecution. Surrender would be accepted immediately. Weapons powered down would not be fired upon. Crews would be secured, treated and tried according to evidence and law, not summary judgment. No executions, no reprisals, trials, not annihilation. The words carried weight because of what had already been demonstrated, because the humans were speaking from a position that could afford mercy. And the contrast forced its way into every surviving calculation. The broadcast included numbers, delivered with the same calm precision as the railgun fire before it. Engagement duration projected at 6 hours total. Evacuation corridors holding 20 million civilians already clear of the battle space. Medical and containment ships en route on vectors calculated to avoid further conflict. This was not rhetoric. It was infrastructure. "We don't kill prisoners." The line stood alone, a hard edge of certainty, and several Council captains felt their crews exhale as if a pressure they had not acknowledged had finally been released. Others raged, calling it deception, demanding renewed fire, but without central command their voices competed with the evidence on every screen. Human weapons, still hot, still aligned, still capable of resuming the arithmetic at any second. The restraint was deliberate. A demonstration that control extended not just to violence, but to its absence. The human battleship adjusted its orientation slightly, broadcasting visual feeds of recovery craft deploying, small and unarmed, moving among wreckage to retrieve escape pods from both sides. Actions logged and time-stamped in the open, as if daring anyone to accuse them of theatre. Council gunnery crews watched humans pull survivors from shattered hulls they themselves had created, and the cognitive dissonance spread faster than fear. Law follows force. Force yields to law. The broadcast ended without flourish, without threats, leaving behind a silence filled only by the hum of surviving systems and the distant movement of rescue craft. And in that quiet, choices crystallized. Some Council ships powered down their weapons immediately, status lights shifting to neutral. Others hesitated, drifting, awaiting orders that would never come. The humans did not rush them. They held their lines, patient, as if time itself had been brought under jurisdiction. When the channels finally cleared, the battle space had changed shape, not through fire but through definition, and the next phase approached not as chaos, but as procedure. They learned the truth from those who had already stopped pretending. As surrender signals multiplied and weapons powered down across drifting council hulls, external observers finally spoke. Neutral monitors, trade guild recorders, peripheral species long accustomed to watching empires clash from a safe remove. And their feeds stitched together a picture that had never appeared on the council's internal boards. Human fleets had not surged outward in response to the incursion. They had been waiting, distributed across deep space in quiet arcs and blind volumes. Mass held in reserve along vectors mapped centuries ago. Readiness measured not in alerts, but in permanence. The 67 ships visible now were not an emergency force. They were a surface layer. Defectors confirmed it with the weary precision of officers whose illusions had burned away. Human doctrine, they said, was not reactive. It was archival. Battle plans referenced contingencies older than the Council itself, written, revised, and drilled across generations, crews rotating through hulls whose layouts had not changed because they did not need to. Training logs surfaced, showing sustained acceleration profiles practiced until Mach-equivalent burns were routine. Casualty simulations run to exhaustion, and then refined. Moral directives embedded alongside firing solutions so deeply that restraint was automatic rather than debated. This wasn't preparation. It was inheritance. Sensor ghosts resolved into reality as more human ships powered from passive to active across adjacent volumes, not joining the fight so much as revealing that they had always been there, watching lanes, guarding corridors, covering evacuation routes before the first shot had been fired. Council analysts cross-referenced timestamps and felt something like vertigo as they realized that the humans had known where the Council would enter, how they would form, how long they would talk, and how they would fire. The mockery in the opening minutes replayed now as evidence, not arrogance, but bait. They planned for this. A captured Council tactician, voice shaking but lucid, explained it plainly over an open channel. Human readiness was absolute because it was boring, because nothing about it depended on surprise or improvisation, because fleets were maintained at a level of discipline that assumed war was inevitable, but panic was optional. Even their mercy protocols were old, field-tested across internal conflicts the galaxy had never seen. Refined until justice could be executed under fire without slowing the machine. Centuries, not months. Observers updated their reports in real, time-to stripping language of speculation, replacing it with dates and citations as the scale of the revelation settled in. The humans had not built for conquest, nor for defense alone, but for contact under worst assumptions, and the Council's mistake had been believing that peace made preparation obsolete. Nearby systems recalculated political gravity as quietly as they had once accepted Council law. Watching human ships hold position with unshowy confidence, logistics flowing without haste, chains of command intact because they had never been stressed. Readiness is not visible until tested. The remaining Council captains understood now that there would be no sudden reversal, no hidden reserve to save them, because the humans had already accounted for everything worth accounting for. And the silence that followed this realization was not despair, but comprehension. As the next phase began to take shape, containment, boarding, adjudication, the truth settled across every surviving display with the weight of history. The war had not awakened humanity. It had merely confirmed their posture. The second phase began without announcement. Human ships moved not as a charge, but as a closing system, vectors adjusting in small, continuous increments as boarding craft, missile boats, and suppression platforms detached and flowed outward, filling the broken geometry of the battle space with intent. The remaining Council formations tried to reorganize, fragments clustering around surviving flagships, but every attempt at coherence was met by pressure applied exactly where it hurt most. Propulsion knocked out without hull breach, sensor masts severed. Weapon capacitors drained by targeted strikes that left ships blind, mute, and drifting. The humans were no longer killing command. They were removing options, numbers accumulated with ruthless clarity. 300 ships disabled in the first 10 minutes, engines cold and weapons locked out by intrusion codes the Council had never imagined an external force could execute in flight. Another 500 followed as suppression missiles burst among tight clusters, electromagnetic blooms washing over systems tuned for elegance rather than resilience, leaving crews alive and terrified inside ships that could no longer obey them. The humans did not linger. Each action fed the next, pressure applied, result logged, move on. This was neutralization. Boarding actions began where resistance persisted, human craft docking with methodical precision, hulls cut open only when necessary, teams moving through corridors with the same calm efficiency their ships had shown in vacuum. Council crews were disarmed, restrained, catalogued. Those who fought were subdued quickly, not executed, and the pattern spread faster than the humans themselves as captains watching neighboring hulls go dark made calculations their predecessors never had the chance to complete, power down, drift, live. Surrender cascaded outward as the arithmetic became impossible to ignore. Every minute of resistance added damaged ships to an already clogged battle space, making escape harder and survival less likely, while those who complied were marked, bypassed, and left intact for later processing under the human's definition, if the word. Status boards across the human fleet updated continuously, counters ticking upward with the same steady rhythm as the earlier kill shot. 1,200 incapacitated, 2,100, 3,200, 3,200 ships removed from the fight. The Council's numerical advantage collapsed not in fire, but in congestion. A sea of drifting hulls blocking vectors, fouling sensors, and turning once proud formations into hazards that trapped their own allies. Human ships exploited the clutter, with practiced ease, using it as cover, as leverage, as proof that battle spaces could be shaped long after shots stopped being exchanged. Missiles fired now carried payloads of code and countermeasures rather than explosives, detonating in proximity, to flood systems with instructions they could not refuse. No heroics. No speeches, just work. A pocket of resistance flared near the outer ring, several hundred ships attempting a breakout under concentrated fire, and the humans responded not by annihilating it but by splitting it, targeted strikes carving the cluster into smaller, isolated groups that lost mutual support within seconds. Engines failed, weapons died. The breakout dissolved into drifting silence, and surrender beacons followed one by one, lighting up the tactical display like a constellation rewriting itself. They can't move anymore. Human command channels remained. Quiet. Orders transmitted in compressed bursts, crews acting on doctrine rather than improvisation, and the absence of drama unsettled the Council more than chaos ever had. There was no rallying cry to fight against, no singular enemy to hate, only a process unfolding with indifferent competence. Boarding logs showed compliance rates climbing as word spread that surrendered crews were being treated, fed, stabilized, and secured without abuse. Mercy scaled with dominance. As the hours wore on, resistance dwindled to isolated ships whose captains either could not accept the new reality or could not communicate their intent. And even these were handled without urgency, disabled, boarded, resolved. Human casualty reports remained minimal, injuries logged and rotated out with clinical efficiency, reinforcing the impression that this was not a desperate gamble but the execution of a plan finally allowed to run its course. By the end of the 6th hour, the battle space was quiet in a way the Council had never experienced. Not the hush before disaster, but the stillness after a system had been brought under control. Drift fields marked where ships waited for processing. Boarding craft returned on schedule. Medical transports moved along established corridors. The counters stopped climbing, not because targets were exhausted, but because there were none left. Worth counting, 3,200 incapacitated. The humans held position amid the wreckage, not triumphant, not exhausted, simply present, and for the surviving Council crews, the truth settled with inescapable weight. The domination had not been a moment of fury, but a managed outcome, and it was already over. The aftermath was quiet by design. Human ships transitioned from combat posture to custody operations with no visible seam between them, lanes opening through the debris field as recovery craft moved methodically among disabled hulls, docking, stabilizing, and cataloguing without hurry. Of the shattered armada, 410 council ships remained intact enough to register as survivors, their crews alive, systems secured, weapons sealed under remote lockouts that did not humiliate so much as conclude. Status lights shifted to neutral across the field, a muted constellation marking compliance rather than defeat. No one fired. Civilians were prioritized first, evacuation corridors already clear, and holding steady as 20 million lives completed, transit away from the wreckage, monitored by human traffic control with the same calm precision that had guided railgun fire hours earlier. Medical transports followed, docking with both human and council hulls. Triage teams moving without distinction between uniforms, injuries logged, treated, stabilized, and transferred. Council captains watched humans tend to crews they had just overpowered, and the contradiction dissolved into something simpler. This was how it was done. Mercy, executed at scale. Detention protocols unfolded openly. Crews were disarmed, not stripped. Command staff were separated, not paraded. Evidence packets assembled automatically from battle telemetry, communications logs, and recovered data cores. Building cases that would not be decided here, in vacuum and adrenaline, but later, in courts that had already been scheduled. The humans did not argue the charges over the open channels. They cited them, numbered and indexed, and moved on. "We will be tried," one council officer said, stunned. "Yes," came the reply, unadorned. "And you will survive to attend." That sentence traveled farther than any weapon discharge. Across neutral systems and watching fleets, the meaning propagated quickly. Surrender did not erase accountability, but it preserved existence. The council's old calculus, domination or annihilation, no longer applied, and the shift was not theoretical. Trade guilds flagged new risk models. Border systems delayed long-standing petitions to the council and opened quiet channels toward human space, asking procedural questions that had nothing to do with war and everything to do with governance. Political gravity began to move. Human command released casualty summaries without ceremony, confirming minimal losses on their side, and verified survival counts on the council's numbers precise enough to resist propaganda. The transparency itself was a statement, as unsettling as it was reassuring. There was no victory speech, no demand for fealty, only a timetable, transfer of detainees, continuation of evacuation support, establishment of interim oversight until trials commenced. No executions, no disappearances, law applied. A single human cruiser passed slowly through the field of surrendered ships, broadcasting navigational corrections and safety advisories, as if guiding traffic after a storm, and council. Crews followed them instinctively, relieved to be told what to do next. The war had not ended in cheers or ashes, but in paperwork and patience, and that more than the fire, reshaped how the galaxy understood power. Survive. Surrender. Be judged. As the last evacuation lanes closed and the counters finalized, the IASTM battle space settled into a stable pattern of custody and care, and the humans held their positions without spectacle. Anchors rather than conquerors. Nearby systems adjusted their orbits, politically and economically, toward the force that had proven it could dominate without indulging in destruction. By the time the final transfer schedules were confirmed, the truth was unavoidable. The Council had lost a battle, but humanity had changed the rules by which the next century would be decided. The battle ended because there was nothing left to resolve. 6 hours after the first shot, Human Command logged the engagement as complete, not with ceremony but with a timestamp. Systems shifting from custody operations to perimeter watch as the last surrendered hulls were secured and evacuation traffic tapered off into routine. The battle space was orderly now, debris catalogued, Drift vectors stabilized, human ships holding quiet orbits among the remains of a force that had once claimed inevitability. Silence settled, not fragile but maintained. Then the sensors spoke. It began as background noise at the extreme edge of detection, fluctuations so faint they would have been dismissed hours earlier as post-combat interference, but the human arrays isolated them with patient precision, filtering out known signatures, subtracting wreckage echoes, stripping the data down until 3 distinct returns remained, evenly spaced along the outer rim, far beyond Council territory, far beyond any mapped trade route. The signals were old, traveling for years before arriving here, and they did not match anything in the shared archives. 3 contacts. Distance estimates stretched comprehension, positions anchored in regions the Council had marked as quiet not because they were empty, but because nothing had ever answered from them. Power curves suggested scale rather than speed, movement deliberate. Trajectories aligned toward populated space with the indifference of mass following gravity rather than intent following strategy. Human analysts did not speculate aloud. They logged, compared, and cross-referenced with records older than the Council's founding Outer Rim origin, unclassified, potential exterminator signature. The surviving Council officers were not told at first, not because the humans wished to hide it, but because procedure demanded confirmation before announcement, and panic was inefficient. Internal human channels filled with restrained updates, contingency markers lighting up on strategic maps that expanded outward far beyond the scope of the battle just concluded. Fleets that had remained passive until now adjusted posture subtly. Readiness states ticking upward without urgency. This was not surprise. It was recognition. A human sensor officer noted that the vectors were convergent. Another confirmed signal, coherence across multiple bands. A third marked the time differential and nodded once, satisfied that the math held. 3 signals, moving slowly, inexorably, on paths that suggested patience measured in centuries rather than campaigns. The Council had believed itself the apex. It had merely been loud. Human command authorized expanded surveillance and long range. Probes, orders transmitted with the same calm discipline that had governed every phase of the engagement so far. No alarms sounded. No speeches followed. The fleets remained where they were, custody operations continuing as scheduled, because the present still required attention, even as the future announced itself. Beyond the quiet rim, something was coming, and humanity, having finished one war without haste or excess, turned its gaze outward, already calculating what restraint would look like when mercy might no longer be an option.